Perfect. So you wanted to talk about trans women being women. Yeah, what's your stance on the topic?
Um, well, I'm trying to kind of flesh that out.
Hmm.
I got into politics when I was like 13 originally, and I just kind of like free fell down the alt-right pipeline, and then I was saved eventually by Hassan and Bosch.
Nice,
um,
nice. Always,
and
always
I've
good to see
been,
people being pulled out of that alt-right pipeline.
yeah. So I found myself just kind of like parroting other people's takes, but I feel like I've been in the space long enough now to kind of like form my own opinion. So very recently, I just sort of like started fresh. I flushed everything out, and I'm trying to rework all my political opinions from the ground up. So,
Totally, totally.
um, I guess we'll start off by making sure that we're talking about the same thing. I
Hmm.
make a distinction between sex and gender. I think those are two different things.
Yeah,
Do we
I
agree
would
on
I
that?
would agree. Sex being much more so biological, and gender being much more so social, right?
Yes, both on a
Perfect.
spectrum, sex to a lesser
Oh my
extent,
gosh,
but
somebody who from the get-go agrees that sex exists along a spectrum. We are blessed to have this conversation. Thank goodness.
I hope so. We'll see. Um, so yeah, I guess I have an I consider, well, I don't consider, I'd say that gender is a social construct,
Mhm,
and because of that, it's malleable. We can change it, right?
mhm.
And gender has this utility of allowing us to see somebody and then quickly make assumptions and sort of identify them based off a set of cultural norms, I guess. So, like, if you see someone playing the piano, based on their attributes, you'll be able to say she's playing the piano, he's playing the piano, and that's kind of the utility that gender has served for a really long time. Would we agree on that?
I would say that that's one of the utilities that gender serves. I think there's also a utility in terms of gender identity and how it allows people to understand and express themselves. But yes, I do think that I guess there is currently a societal use for gender in terms of, recognizing and categorizing people. Although I, as a gender abolitionist, would say there is even more utility in abolishing this notion of gender altogether.
Right. Okay. But when you say gender helps people self-identify, um, that it allows people to sort of outwardly express their internal perception of their gender.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Um, I guess I have trouble understanding how we are able to give trans women the title of women without it sort of imploding on itself and becoming this like nebulous cloud where the word woman means essentially nothing.
So there are lots of ways that we could define the term woman, and kind of
Yeah.
more so how language works in general is that there's
Mhm.
basically never like one single objective, all-encompassing definition of any word. Often, how it tends to work is that outside of like hyper-specific scientific terms, words are very much contextual in what they precisely mean. And so, like, when people use the term woman, sometimes they are referring to people that have certain biological characteristics. Sometimes when people use the term woman, they're referring to people that have a certain lived social experience or people who perhaps fulfill certain gendered roles. Sometimes when people are using the term woman, they're referring to a self perception or a psychological state, one's own relationship to the societal phenomenon of gender. And I think that all of those definitions are valid in their own right. And we could even try to combine them into some kind of like super definition if we wanted to. Something like an individual who identifies as a feminine gender based on femaleness, femininity, opposition to patriarchy, sisterhood, motherhood. All of these different things can tie into womanhood, but basing it on kind of that sincere identity. And you can definitely make an identity-based definition along that, or you can just recognize that all these different definitions apply in different contexts, and there are lots of ways in which trans women can meet those definitions. There are many female sex characteristics that trans women do develop if they medically transition, transsexual females more specifically. A trans woman can absolutely have the lived social experience of a woman, and in terms of psychological state, well, that would include both cis women and trans women, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I think I would agree with that. When I engage with gender, my experience engaging with it, typically I would see somebody and I have a perception of them in my head based off my perception of gender norms. So when I look at you, my brain instantly says that you're a woman. I
Hmm.
would refer to you as a and there are people who identify as a woman, yet I look at them and my brain does not see them as a woman.
Hmm.
And I can listen to their request to call them, to use their preferred pronouns, but that feels like I'm lying to them
Hmm.
because
I,
it's
I
it's
think
hard
that
for
I
me
think that
to.
the way that I think of it is you are aiding that person in their social transition. So it seems you absolutely recognize that somebody can fully achieve a social transition and become the opposite gender purely for social reasons. And so if you see somebody who say they're like a trans woman who is early into transition, they might not pass very well. Um, by gendering them the way in which they prefer, you are giving them experience living as you are helping them in their process of social transitioning, and there is absolutely a utility in doing so because we recognize that this type of social transition is valid and something that can be achieved, and helping them in that social transition improves their mental health, improves their overall well-being. I believe that the proper way to think about it is you are aiding their social transition by gendering them as they wish as part of that social transition.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with that. When somebody asks me to use their preferred pronouns, those are the pronouns I use
Yeah.
because only negatives can come from not using them. But I think there's more, there's like a philosophical issue underlying that, apart from the utility that me using their pronouns will offer.
What is that philosophical issue you see?
Well, it seems incongruent to me that we can have um, a social system that's supposed to offer useful utility, and like those to me need to be something concrete and not nearly as malleable as they are now. For me to l- lie to somebody,
So I,
to
hmm, I think that there's a couple things going on there. One is that social categories, especially, they are very much so not concrete. Like if you're trying to figure out what it means, for example, to be a sports fan or like a fan of a specific sports team, it's really hard to provide this kind of concrete definition for something which is so both social and kind of internal psychological in nature. Like somebody could certainly claim to be a fan of the Lakers, but like depending on how much they watch the Lakers or if they actually enjoy the team, there could also very well be someone who watches every Lakers game, yet they're not a fan of the team. I think that it's very hard to come up with an objective, perfectly consistent definition of any of these social categories. I mean, let alone other words in general. I think that even for something as simple as chair, it is impossible to come up with a perfectly consistent definition because what definitions were supposed to be. They were never supposed to be these kind of things where we have perfectly consistent 100% objectivity. Rather, they're more so kind of general usage guides to get you started in understanding how language is used in practice. We can get into defining what is a chair if you want an example of this.
um yeah, I think chair even has a more stable and concrete definition than woman does right now.
Yes, I would agree, but I would also say that even chair does not have like a stable, concrete, objective, perfectly consistent definition.
Yeah, and I'm okay with words sort of existing on a spectrum that we can use, right? Like no definition will be all encompassing,
Mhm.
but I think woman exceeds that. It goes way beyond being on a spectrum. It seems to be. What is your definition of a woman?
I think that there are lots of definitions of woman, just like there are lots of definitions of any other word. But like I said earlier, people can form a biological definition or a social definition based on lived experience. They could form a social definition based off of performativity. We could also form a psychological definition based off of a self perception. So I'm the kind of person where I'm going to say, like, my dictionary is going to have like these four different definitions of woman, and they're all valid in their own right.
Hmm.
Because I think that that's just how words work in general. Words are very much contextual and have lots of different definitions depending on what is most useful. I think that the example of what water means is a really good way of illustrating this concept. So, the stuff in rivers, we call it water, right? Like that is water.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And then the stuff that comes out of the tap that we can drink, that's also water, right?
Yes.
And then pure H2O is once again water.
All
But
three of
yeah,
those examples
all,
would
all
be pure H2O.
so none of only pure H2O would be pure H2O in that instance. River water it contains so many other substances. It is very dirty. Tap water has all these little minerals and additives which allow our bodies to actually digest the water. And so, for my example is if somebody says, "Oh my gosh, I'm thirsty. I need some water." If you give them river water, although river water is water, you didn't give them the definition of water that they are looking for. The definition of river water being water and drinking water being water and pure H2O being water are all valid within their own context, within their own right, but there is no universality of what makes something water. It's all based off of this kind of contextual utility of water. In the instance where I'm thirsty, the utility of water is something I can drink.
So we have already covered that definitions will exist on a spectrum.
Mhm.
So when people refer to that spectrum contains um, the things you just mentioned, tap water, river water, that kind of thing. But the foundational base that we use to determine what can be considered water is the presence of H2O. There's still something that unifies all those terms.
There is definitely that common characteristic, and we could also point to similar common characteristics or roughly common characteristics with respect to women or any other kind of like category.
Yeah. So when I think of what a woman is, I'll
Mhm.
think of um, somebody who has long hair, maybe a quieter voice. They dress a certain way. These kind of, I think of the typical social norms
Mhm.
with respect to a woman, and I think that when we lump, um, when we put trans women into that group, rather than having their own trans woman group, that it creates an inconsistency that isn't present with the water and H2O example either.
I don't think that there's any inconsistency at all in including trans women. What do you believe that inconsistency to be?
That they that the spectrum that trans women can exist on in which it, with respect to how they present themselves is too varied that simply identifying as a woman will not constitute um, being able to join the woman category as it's socially presented.
Honestly, I believe that kind of like the ways in which trans women present themselves can absolutely be very much so contained within kind of these spaces that intersex women, that gender nonconforming women already operate. I don't think it is like a push to expand this entire notion of what a woman means. And we can also always point to the consistency of all of these women have a self perception of themselves being of a feminine gender. We can absolutely point to that as kind of this core consistent element, but at the same time, I think that like unlike kind of the water example, it I guess unless you are using a self perception or an identity as the core unifying element which groups all of the women together, you are never going to be able to find any kind of like consistent single item that like makes somebody a woman. Um,
I I think that we could,
what would that
but we
be?
don't. Well, it would be a spectrum still, but it would be we'll use just the sort of typical social norms that exist right now
Hmm.
for classifying.
So I guess like if we're trying to define womanhood in terms of like this social spectrum of like the roles and expectations which people either fulfill or that is assigned to them, there would absolutely be like gender nonconforming cis women who would not meet this or would meet it less than like many trans women would.
It's not a binary that everybody has to fit into,
Okay, I agree with that. Um, hmm. I
but
guess like
it is. Um, I think if we're gonna have gender, I am a gender abolitionist, but in the position that we're in right now, it just doesn't make any sense. Like there's no consistency all across the board.
well, I would say that gender in and of itself tends to be quite the incoherent concept, and that's a very strong argument for gender abolition. And I
Yeah,
would also argue that a true gender abolitionist ought to be down to just acknowledge that gender is messy and it's okay if it's messy in the process of abolishing gender. And so if a trans woman wants to be part of the category of woman until it is abolished, I don't see any issue with that.
yeah. Well, I think just philosophically, the whole thing is falling apart as we have it right now. I think we need to either,
How is it falling apart?
well, because woman has no definition, and when you identify as a
Well, we could go
woman,
with this the self perception of being a feminine gender.
yeah, the issue with that would be that that won't, if that doesn't reflect the stereotypical perception that most people have of gender, I will be unable to look at that person and see um, whatever gender they are identifying as.
So I guess I don't think that gender identity is something you can see. I think that there are lots of things which we can define which might not be visible to the naked eye, such as whether or not someone's a sports fan, for example.
Yeah, so not being able to see, not being able to look at somebody and tell their gender, if that's the direction we're going, completely undermines the concept and the utility of the gender binary I've set up right now.
But you already acknowledged that the gender binary is not a useful construct. So I guess I don't see how that's an issue.
It's an issue because it exists right now and it's present. Ideally, we can abolish it, but right
Hmm.
now it's a mess, and we're getting massive pushback from people who aren't progressive. And I think that there's merit to that pushback, not in the sense that um, trans people are invalid, but in the sense that the structure we're trying to instate right now is completely incoherent.
I think that even if we ignore the existence of trans women for a minute, this notion of gender has to have a utility, and I can see your gender and understand what your gender is. Already is incoherent. For example, there are so many butch lesbians who you would not know that they are women. There are so many femboys that you would not know that they are men. I think that even excluding the existence of trans people, ignoring that, setting that aside for a minute, this concept of gender being something which we can see and infer is already incoherent.
Um, when I look at somebody,
Hmm.
my brain will gender them, and I think most people's brains will gender them.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with people kind of like seeing somebody and then assigning a gender to them. Although I just hope that people would recognize that they might be wrong about that. For example, if they see a femboy and they think that he's a girl, you might have had a wrong perception about them. And if you're okay being corrected on that, then that's totally fine. And this is something that can, slowly be unlearned, where you might, see more like androgynous people, and you might not make that assumption, or you might be like, oh, I'm actually not sure what their gender is, and I don't intrinsically gender them. Like it can definitely be
Yeah,
unlearned to an extent.
sure, but I think that the construct of gender begs and demands that we gender people. That's what it's there for.
But you prescriptively disagree with that. So like why do we need to uphold that?
I'm not saying that we necessarily do uphold it. I'm a, I think the whole thing's just a mess, but how
I
do
agree with you.
we
It is a mess. I don't think
yeah,
there's any way we can reconcile it. I think that the best we can do is get kind of typicalities or generalities. But no, I
mm,
don't think we can like perfectly reconcile it. I think that's an impossible goal. Even forgetting about trans people, I think that's an impossible goal.
I think that people being I think that people identifying with a gender is an issue
How so?
because it's not possible to have other people view you how you identify.
Well, I want to be clear.
And
I don't have any issue with people like seeing somebody and making an assumption about their gender, so long as they're okay being corrected. But if there's ever somebody where you're unsure of their gender, and need to know their gender for something, you can like always ask. And I don't think there's any issue with like asking, like, oh, what are your pronouns or whatnot.
right, but I still think there's an issue with the um, expectation that I have to perceive their identity the or not that I have to perceive it that I well yeah they that I have to perceive their identity the way that they feel it is.
So I think that I think that it's weird to have somebody state an identity to you and for you to not believe them, or to be like, I don't agree with how you view yourself. um for example, like if
It's not
somebody tells you that they're a Lakers fan, do you have any right to be like, you're not a Lakers fan?
um I don't know. I don't think that's it's not about like calling them out on it. If somebody identifies as a woman,
Hmm.
I look at them and I feel I think there's a distinction between thinking something and feeling something, right? When I look at people, I don't really think their gender identity into existence. I sort of feel it into existence.
Do you feel their gender identity, or do you feel their gender presentation?
Their gender presentation.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key distinction is you're not really feeling their identity. You wouldn't like know their identity unless they were to like tell you. What you're doing, like when your brain genders someone, you're kind of doing like a vibe check based off of their gendered presentation, which is not the same thing as like understanding their identity. It's kind of like how if you see somebody at like a Lakers game, you might get a vibe that they're like a fan of the Lakers, but unless they like directly tell you that they are a fan of the Lakers, or take actions to show that they're a fan of the Lakers, you wouldn't really know that they're like an actual fan in terms of how they view themselves, or in terms of their identity.
Yeah, I guess if I look at somebody and I need to decide whether or not they're a Lakers fan, that is going to be something that happens independent of their perception of themselves. I think I have an issue with the I
But what is
people.
being a Lakers fan other than a self perception, like a personal aspiration that they enjoy the Lakers?
Okay, can we use this analogy is making my brain hurt. It's not a bad analogy. I'm just unable to um, engage with it. Can we use the? Can we just stick to gender?
I think that this analogy really kind of highlights why it's silly to, be like, just because I assume something based off of how you might present yourself or just because of the actions you might take, you still personally don't know their identity. I think that that's exactly why
Okay,
this
okay.
this kind of
We,
analogy is a good one in this
I,
situation. And
I
once
don't.
again, I don't have any problem with you making like assumptions about people's gender based off their presentation, but if you prescriptively agree with the concept of social transition, if you prescriptively agree with the concept of gender abolition, then I think that respecting people's identity is the best, chillest, easiest way to achieve those goals. Also, thank you for the Prime subscription, OpusBot.
Can we use somebody who's a gamer instead of somebody who's a Lakers fan?
Let's do it. Let's use a gamer.
Sports ball,
Absolutely.
sports ball is out of. Okay. Okay. Can you reframe the question with a
Yeah.
gamer?
So so suppose that like you could obviously observe someone playing video games, but they themselves might not identify as a gamer, or there also could be somebody who doesn't really play very much video games, but they do identify as a gamer. And so, it's okay to have your own perceptions about who may or may not be a gamer based off of, the actions they take in terms of the video games they play. However, ultimately, who truly is a gamer, I think there absolutely is an element of self-identity in there, where to them themselves, if they see themselves as a gamer, then I think that's an identity that ought to be respected. If somebody's like, oh, I see myself as a gamer because I like this game, or somebody's like, I don't really see myself as a gamer, I think it'd be weird for you to like go up and say, well, your identity is invalid because you don't play enough video games, or you play too much video games to not be a gamer. I think that kind of stuff is weird.
Yeah, I think so too. So somebody who identifies as a gamer,
Mhm.
that process of self-identification is something that happens internally within them, and I would say needs to be maintained within themselves. I don't
Yeah, much
see
like a gender
how.
identity.
Well, no, because gender identity is not being held within themselves. It's being projected outward, and
Gender
the
presentation is being projected outward, but gender identity is internal. It's like playing video games
sure,
is projected outward, but being a gamer is internal. That's the analogy.
yes, and my issue is the idea that my validation or my me conforming to their self-identification is necessary to uphold their identification.
I think that an individual's gender identity is valid, and it remains as it is in spite of people respecting it or not. Um,
Yes,
but I think that it's
no.
prescriptively a good thing to do to respect it. Like we know that
Wait, wait.
conversion therapy doesn't work just because somebody
Yeah,
tries to
yes,
convert someone out of having a certain gender identity. Their gender identity remains constant.
yes. No, but it doesn't. It should, but it only remains constant through external validation, which is the issue.
Gender identity is not upheld by social validation. I would say that gender as a lived experience, or the social phenomenon of gender,
So
is what's
if
upheld by external validation.
if
Like that
somebody
the
identifies as a woman,
mhm.
in order to be it, correct me if I'm wrong here, but trans people who have this um, gender dysphoria, their perception of themselves, their self-identification needs to be upheld through external validation by me perceiving them or from them thinking that I perceive them how they perceive themselves.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by like need, because even when trans people are Like even if I encounter somebody who's transphobic and who tries to deny my gender identity remains solid. So I don't think it's something that like I guess I don't think I don't see it as like a need, but rather I see it as an ought, where yeah, you ought to respect people's gender identity, much like how you ought to respect someone's identity as a gamer,
Why ought you respect somebody's gender identity?
because it improves their mental health and overall well-being.
Yes, that's what I'm saying right there. That their identification of themselves needs external validation to withstand itself.
No, the gender identity remains constant in spite of external validation or not. However, external validation can help them to live a better life in general,
How does it help
and that
them
applies
live?
to anybody. I mean, for like this would also apply equally to like gay people, for example. Like somebody is still going to be attracted to men if they're a gay man, even if they live in a homophobic society. However, if they are bullied, if they're told, "No, you can't be gay people aren't real," then they're going to have a lot of mental health issues and worse outcomes. And the same thing's true about trans people. Their gender identity remains solid, remains internal. However, when they are denied that identity, then yeah, you're going to see a lot of negative mental health and poorer outcomes, because that's just social ostracization. That's not intrinsic to like being trans or something. That's just a general property of social ostracization.
So it's not that their gender identity needs external validation, it's that it needs to not be externally ostracized.
Yes, that's my ought claim.
Okay. Um, I I would agree with that. It just seems like that's not the case
How
right now
so?
because people will um, express their gender identity
Hmm.
in order to gain that acceptance of it.
Yeah, I would
I think
definitely agree that like gender expression can be a
ostrac-
valuable tool in obtaining that validation. And there are definitely, like, for example, trans people who might perform more who might perform certain aspects of masculinity or femininity in order to more align themselves with the gender they want to transition to in order to receive that validation. And I think cis people do this too. Like, I don't think it is a a random coincidence that like men typically have short hair because they all just want to naturally have short hair, and that's what they all just naturally want, and is what is most true and authentic to themselves. I think that conforming to society absolutely plays a role in why so many men wear their hair short. I think that if there was not that societal notion, you would see a lot more men that have long hair, for example.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
So I agree with this criticism, although it applies to cis people too.
It applies to cis people because can you explain that
Yeah,
part again?
because cis people also perform gender roles, perform gendered expectations. They perform
Okay, yeah.
aspects of gender presentation, because they want to be seen as the gender which they identify with. Ooh, Pinocchio,
If
thank you so much for the
people
resubscription. Really appreciate that.
people look at me as a man and they don't think that I'm tough, that bothers me. So if somebody is a gamer,
Hmm.
yeah, okay. So I understand that. When you have, I guess the issue is you will have a person who has a certain internal identification of themselves,
Hmm.
and that, yeah, I guess I'm still stuck on assuming it's external validation. That's still, and it can be
I don't
applied
think
to
there's
cis
anything wrong
people.
with seeking external validation for your internal identity. Um, Cis
I
people do
think
that as
it's
well.
I just think it's not sustainable.
Well, you're a gender abolitionist, and I agree. Yeah, I don't think it's sustainable. I think we ought to abolish it.
Yeah, because it would be yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah, I guess like, gender's a mess, absolutely, and so long as somebody wants to abolish gender, I think that respecting people's gender identity absolutely help us in that goal because the muddier the waters of gender are, the closer we are to gender abolition. The more equal things are, the more mutable and wishy-washy things are. That brings us closer to a society where we can abolish gender, or at least the roles and expectations associated with gender.
Problem I have, I don't think that it does do that. When we have a biological man who maybe isn't passing as a woman or feels as though they're a woman internally,
Hmm.
they will make those um, they'll use their gender expression to um, have people view them as a woman.
Yeah.
And that gender expression will typically fall into the binary of what it means to be a woman.
Yeah, cis people do this too.
I'm saying that to have
I
to
guess like if you take this criticism to its logical conclusion, then anybody doing anything that is gender conforming is wrong, and I'm not comfortable with that prescription.
that I think is my prescription. I think that's what
You think that any
not
form
that
of gender conformity is wrong?
not morally wrong. I think that it's I don't look at somebody who is doing something to conform to gender. I would view as a victim, not like a bad actor.
Hmm. I guess like at that point, it's going to be very hard to distinguish whether or not a woman, say, wears her hair long because she likes having long hair, or if she wears her hair long because she wants people to validate her identity as a woman. There's no way you can like actionably discern that. However, your prescription is that if people are feeling pressured to like wear their hair a certain way because of some kind of like gender expectation, that's a bad thing. Then I would agree with that prescription, and I think that the existence of trans people absolutely pushes against um, like the existence of those expectations or absolutist views about those expectations. If we allow people to bend the boundaries of gender and to change genders, then that provides more ways in which people can be gender nonconforming.
Yeah, but we're expanding and bending gender while simultaneously sort of conforming to it. So people are born, I think, as like a blank slate, and
Hmm.
they'll grow up in a society that has gender binaries, and they will fall into one of those groups. That's how they're gonna develop. And you'll have people who are trans or maybe non-binary. They don't identify with either of these two things. And in order to um, validate their internal identity, they will conform to that binary to do that, which to me would just perpetuate the issue, which is those gender binaries.
Um, hmm. I guess like it's really an interesting one because like this criticism would apply to anybody that does anything that is gender conforming, you know? And so, I guess like
Yes.
what is your solution to that? Like how do we avoid the fact that or I guess this critique that any form of gender conformity perhaps upholds gender to an extent? How do we combat that?
Well, it's not just that anybody who conforms to a gender norm is upholding it. It's that we are simultaneously trying to expand and bend it while conforming at the same time. Like an example of a trans woman seeking their gender identity through conforming to the binary.
Mm-hmm. And then, and then like I guess like yeah, that criticism would also equally apply to like a cis woman who, because she wants to be as seen as a woman, she upholds certain forms of gender conformity.
No,
How is it not also gender conformity for a cis woman to do the same thing?
it is gender conformity, but it's
Yeah.
not gender conformity. The typical um
Then I
sit
don't think that like the existence of trans people makes this any worse, because cis people already uphold like gender norms all the time, and there are perhaps some trans people uphold gender norms. Although we
yes.
know that trans people as a group actually are in general as a group very much opposed to gender norms. And I know that with the new trans survey that was done, this is the biggest survey that's ever been done on trans people. It was actually over half of the survey participants identified as non-binary. Like literally more than half of trans people are indeed themselves trying to push against this binary in terms of their own gender identity.
So what if we had
Like descriptively speaking, trans people are better at this than cis people because the majority of
sure.
them are non-binary.
What if we had man, woman as they stand now, and then we had the third category. It's not really a gender, but the absence of gender, right? Those you can be you can identify as a man, you can identify people can identify you as a man, people can identify you as a woman, people can identify you as they them.
Non-binary? I mean, that is kind of how it works right now to an extent.
But y- is that how it works right now?
Yeah, I think that in general, people perceive people either as men, women, or sometimes non-binary or androgynous. It kind of depends on the exact person. There are definitely people that have much more so binary views of gender that try to fit people into like a binary box. But I think that especially amongst more progressive circles and society at large, we're starting to see that there is definitely some in between or some non-binary cases where I might see someone and be like, yeah, I don't know if they're a man or a woman or if they're non-binary or whatever. I definitely, that's personally how I view gender, even as a social phenomenon. When I'm out in public, there are definitely people I see where I'm like, I think they might be non-binary.
Yeah, so it would be an acceptable solution to you to have man, woman, and then just non-conforming. And then gender just exists as it does with that third option.
With a non-binary option, yeah, I absolutely support the existence of non-binary gender identity and non-binary gender expression.
Yeah, that seems like a plausible solution to me.
And trans people would broadly support you with that solution. Trans people are overwhelmingly in favor of non-binary identity, and most trans people are themselves non-binary.
Yeah, yes. I'm reading the comments.
Hmm.
Can I respond to a comment? Is that something I can do?
Yeah, what do you want to respond to?
I just saw it. Digital Dan said, where is it? Where is it?
Digital Dan said the pressure is the issue, not the conformity.
No, before that. Said something about like surely people aren't bad for conforming
Surely,
to
just
gender.
because somebody conforms to generally held view of a gender binary, it doesn't make them bad.
Yes, yes. I just reiterate that I agree with that. I don't view people who conform to gender as bad. I view them as victims to the construct of gender.
So it seems that you more so take issue with when people feel like they ought to conform to things which might not be how they want to genuinely express themselves out of a desire to fit in. Is that right?
Um, I think that people's internal identity ought not to be held up by external anything.
Correct, and that's how it works. Like the conversion therapy does not convert people out of being trans.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how it presently works. Gender identity is absolutely, it seems to be innate in people, and whether or not that's a combination of like genetic, epigenetic factors combined with how you internalize your socialization. Regardless of that, it appears to be that this sense of their own gender is innate. It is internal to them.
Yes, so people have an internal experience of gender.
Hmm.
And then it's the do you think that's biological?
Um, that is a really good question. I think that what I've seen in the medical literature, there appears to be certain biological influences, things like certain genetic factors, things like hormone influences in the womb, which can influence transsexual identity. In terms of like who would actually benefit from, say, like a medical transition. Now, in terms of like the ways in which people are going to express themselves, I think there absolutely can be like biological influences. Things like different hormones, different genes and stuff can certainly play an influence in either like behavioral traits or kind of the activities that you might be predisposed towards being better at or towards liking more. And there certainly can be influences into that. Although I think that especially with regards to more behavioral and kind of activity based stuff, I think that is a lot much more so socialized.
I would agree. I've looked at um, a little bit of like trans research papers, as specifically um, trying to find if there is something that scientists will consider like a female or a male brain. I was wondering if you had any input
Yeah,
on that because
I do definitely know a lot about that. If you want to read about sex of the brain, the best article on this topic, I can actually give it to you right here. It is titled Beyond the Binary Rethinking Sex in the Brain. I can go ahead and send that link to you over Discord. This is a review and analysis of the existing literature on sexual dimorphism in the brain. And kind of the big takeaway is that there is definitely something going on there with either sex and or gender of the brain to a small extent. However, it in no way fits into a binary framework or even into kind of like
right.
a single variable spectrum framework. It seems that
Yeah.
these sexually dimorphic regions of the brain are much more so multivariate in terms of it happens on lots of different axes. Um, you
Yeah.
know, and like I know that a lot of the research on kind of like sex differences in the brain, most of it is due to the average size difference between male and female skulls. And
Hmm.
what this research found was that when you account for that average size difference, then the total variance of brain structure, only 2% of it can be explained by sex and or gender. And this means that the best machine learning models we have trying to predict whether or not someone's brain is male or female, whether or not they have the gender identity of a man or a woman, is about 60% at best. So there is something there, but it's very much so slight and very much so overlapping and very much so something that appears to very well be influenced by biological and sociological factors, things like how neuroplasticity means that our environment can shape our brain.
Yeah. So my understanding of it, I've done a little bit of research, not like enough to have a conclusive opinion on it, but it seems to me like there's multiple parts of the brain that play a role in people's gender identification. It's sort of like when you look at people with schizophrenia, you'll see certain types of brains will have like telltale signs of schizophrenia, but not every brain that looks like that will be a schizophrenic brain.
Yeah. This also has to do with things how like genes can be turned off and on by epigenetics, by hormones, environment, experiences, all this stuff. Absolutely, yeah.
So there's no like little chunk of brain matter that's responsible for people's gender identity. There's no like piece of brain that'll decide if you're female or male.
Our best models on this are about 60% accurate. So it seems that there are certainly some slightly different patterns. However, it's not like there is the sex is stored in the hypothalamus or something. Or gender identity is stored in the hypothalamus and you can find this one gene or this one brain characteristic. It definitely does not seem to work that way.
Yeah. So can you sum up what can you sum up what just happened? Like put it all together so I can make sure we're on the same page.
With respect to the brain stuff or with respect to
Well,
like gender
the stuff before
conformity?
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I still feel yeah, go ahead.
So I believe that I'm going to try to characterize your beliefs right now. It seems that
Okay, yeah.
you believe that I guess your top prescription is that the abolition of gender is a good thing.
Yes.
You seem to think that it is a good thing to respect people's pronouns. Yes.
Water. Yeah, probably.
Okay. Yeah. You think that it is possible for somebody
I
to socially transition to quite literally become the other gender.
yes.
And you believe that when people conform to gender norms or expectations out of a desire to fit into society or to fit into what's expected of them, then they are kind of victims of this process.
Yeah.
I agree with all of those prescriptions.
Okay. Something I got this live stream thing, this Discord call
Mhm.
jumbled my brain. It's hard to
That's okay. That's okay.
something.
I mean, especially you yourself know how amalgamous and incoherent gender as a concept can be, even if we're not talking about trans people. So like, yeah, I get it. This can be brain blasting.
Yeah. Like I had something I wanted to say, but it's left my brain.
That's okay. That's okay. I get that to happen to me all the time. If you do think about it, don't be afraid to shout it out. Um, but in the meantime, was there anything else you wanted to discuss or touch on before we kind of like wrap things up?
I don't know. You have any hot takes?
Any hot takes?
Yeah. You
Um,
have any?
yeah. Do you want like a gender related hot take or just like another hot take in general?
Just throw a couple at me.
Let's see. I think that there are a lot of trans femme eggs in the men's rights activist movement that don't know that they're actually trans women.
You think that there's a lot of trans femme men
Like
who
people who don't know that they're trans women that are in like the men's rights activist movement because of their disillusionment with manhood.
you think it's possible to have a wrong perception about your identity?
Um, yes. I do think that it is possible. Like I did when I thought I was a man.
It, yeah, is there a difference between um like having your identity change versus having it be completely wrong?
I think that with respect to
Like
things
you
like gender
thought,
identity and sexual orientation, I think that it tends to be the case that like that identity is intrinsic to them. However, they didn't realize what that meant. Like
okay,
for
so
me, kind of my understanding of gender and who I want to be was always that I wanted to be a girl, I wanted to be a woman, but it wasn't but I didn't understand that as a trans experience. So like I always had those feelings, but I didn't have the language to understand myself as the person that I ought to be. And I think this can also happen with like gay people, where it's like, if they're never taught about like the existence of gay people, they can be like, well, I have these feelings for people of the same gender, but I just have to date the opposite gender because that's what society tells me. I think that I think that there absolutely is a phenomenon where people, like that identity is intrinsic, or that part of them is intrinsic, but they have the language or the understanding to understand themselves better as they gain that
Yeah,
language, as they understand kind of like what these common experiences are like.
yeah. So, safe to say that you always had this intrinsic identity as a woman, but that was clouded by social pressure,
Yeah,
and then eventually discovered it.
and
So
also
it's not
just
that you,
like for me it was like back then, my understanding of gender was that, well, people told me I was a boy, so I must be a boy. I didn't have this notion that one's gender identity could be different than their biological sex that was assigned to them at birth, or the way in which society sees you. I didn't really realize that like transition was like an option for me. I thought that like trans people have like always known that like they are transgender, and that they know exactly who they are. um, when for me it was much more so a re-understanding of, oh, this is who I ought to be, that allowed me to transition.
yeah. So it's not that people can have people can have the wrong identity. It's that they're not able to get in touch with it.
Yeah, or their understanding of what this intrinsic identity is what's wrong. Like their understanding is wrong. It's not the identity that's wrong.
So you think there's lots of you think there's lots of femboys that are trans women but have been unable to reach that conclusion because of social pressure.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, that was me until I was 21 years old. And my hot take was specifically in kind of like the men's rights activist movement. Kind of part of like the right wing pipeline. These are people that like really want to bring like men's issues to the forefront. A lot of them end up going kind of in like a misogynistic direction. But I think that there's definitely a decent number of people who are secretly trans women but don't know it yet, in that movement, because of how disillusioned they are with being men, how they dislike how society perceives them as a man, how society treats them for being a man, and that's why they are amicable to some of the rhetoric of the men's rights activist movement. And I think that there's definitely a group of trans women in that movement that don't know that they're trans women. That's my hot take.
Yeah, that's probably accurate. And at the very least, it's funny to view
Yes, I did
paid
start
support.
transitioning 2 years ago. I've been on HRT for just 2 years.
That hot take's fine. I got nothing to say about that one.
Okay, okay. Coolio. I think that's a fun hot take. Let's see.
Yeah,
Do you want like a video game related hot take?
nah, nah,
No?
no. I want something like I want something juicy. Like are you racist?
No, I'm not racist. Or at least
Good.
I try my best to be anti-racist, although I think that, being somebody who grew up in a conservative household, being somebody who, I have absolutely the privileges of being white. I think that there is definitely forms of internalized racism which, have been inside me that I, can do my best to work to unlearn, but I try my best to be an anti-racist person.
Yeah, yeah. So you have internal microaggressions that'll pop up every now and then, but
I think that most everybody
you
has internalized forms of
yeah,
racism to an extent, especially
yeah,
people of kind of like the dominant racial class in a given society. Yeah, absolutely. Because for people in that dominant racial class, they have the privilege of not having to think about race. I can just like go about my day and not think about race, and it's not a problem. If you're, say, somebody who grew up in like a black family, black kids have that talk from their parents about the police, and how they have to be cognizant of how police are going to treat them differently because they're black. How interactions with other people and the racist connotations of those interactions make you hyper aware of racism. And so I think that, yeah, especially people of like a dominant racial class, they tend to internalize a lot of this racism without ever even knowing it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Um,
Sick.
okay. The the question I had looming that left my brain has kind of come back to me in sporadic pieces. I th- when
What
we were
was the
talking
question?
about, it wasn't a question. It was a I don't know. It's a weak statement. When
Okay.
what was your response to me? I said that gender. I said that people's identities should not be structured so that they can only be validated through external things.
I agree with that statement, and I think that gender identity does tend to work that way because conversion therapy doesn't work. If your gender identity was contingent on validation, then why would pre-transition trans people have that identity? Why would conversion therapy not work? You know?
No. It's not that it's contingent on it. It's that people can have conversion therapy doesn't work. People who have you can't change somebody's identity. I guess what I'm saying is that there should be some kind of I feel like there should be some kind of internal work to not need external validation to validate your identity. And I'm not talking about people who are
Yeah,
ostracized.
I think that if people can find acceptance from within, then that is a very mentally healthy thing to do. And that should absolutely be a goal for people. I just hope that people would have an understanding of how, you know, societal systems of marginalization and ostracization can make that more difficult, especially for people who maybe don't pass, as say like the gender which they identify with, or you know people who are say are gay and like living in homophobic societies. Absolutely, true acceptance does come from within,
Yeah.
but there are systems in place which can make that harder for people. And if we can address
Yes.
those
And
systems, then I think that it's going to be easier for people to accept themselves from within. And I think that that is
yes.
a good prescription.
So with the end goal being gender abolition,
Hmm.
we've already talked about how people conforming, trans or not, people conforming to these gender norms in order to gain external validation for their identity is perpetuating the cycle. Do you agree with that?
That people seeking validation by conforming to gender is upholding that cycle.
Yes.
Um, to some extent, yes, and that applies to cis people more so than trans people.
Sure. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. We're yes. Yes. We're yes.
Okay, yeah.
But but cis people aren't the ones with the dysphoria.
Oh,
So
cis
I'm
people
focusing.
absolutely experience gender dysphoria. When men get things
Yes.
like
Yes. Yes.
hair transplants, when women get
Yes.
things like
Yes.
face surgery and boob jobs, cis people
Yes.
absolutely
Yes.
experience gender dysphoria and try
Yeah.
to conform to
But
alleviate that gender dysphoria. Absolutely, they
yeah. Yeah.
do.
Okay. Yes. But it's different in the sense that that is all externalized pressure, where with trans people they have this innate um physiological dysphoria.
So do the cis people that get these surgeries and hair transplants and stuff. I think it's the same kind of gender dysphoria in the cis person and the trans
Well,
person, or maybe not the
um
same kind, but
I,
I think it operates in kind of the same way.
maybe, but we know why cis men get hair transplants.
Because of gender dysphoria.
There's and from my perception there's two types of gender dysphoria. I guess we have to make that distinction.
Like sex
um
dysphoria versus gender dysphoria.
yes, that's what I'm
Yeah,
talking about.
I agree with that
Sex.
distinction.
Okay, so people yeah, sorry. People with sex dysphoria will change their presentation to be in order to gain validation for their
No, that would
internal
be dealing with gender
identity.
dysphoria. If you're dealing with sex dysphoria, that would be things like medical transition.
Those two things are very closely related. No, people who have
Related, sure,
gender
but
dysphoria is
if we're
a
distinguishing sex dysphoria from gender dysphoria, then like wearing a dress doesn't do anything for sex dysphoria. That would be more so like a gender dysphoria thing, or getting like a hair
no,
transplant would probably be more so like a gender dysphoria thing.
well, sex and gender are correlated, right? We typically will assume somebody's sex based off how we gender them.
Yeah, I agree that those they're highly
Yeah,
correlated and that we make those assumptions generally.
yeah. So when there's somebody who's having sex dysphoria, they will, like a man who is a woman will change their presentation. No, a male who is a female will change their presentation to that of a woman's, so people will then perceive them as a female.
Um, I think that if you're talking about people's perception, you're talking about gender and gender dysphoria. Like, but if you're talking about like biological characteristics, then you would be talking about like sex dysphoria, if we're making that distinction. I think that you might be kind of conflating sex and gender with the way in which you worded that.
I don't think I'm conflating them. I recognize the difference, but there's still points where those overlap.
Like
For
with
like
respect to
the
myself, if I'm experiencing like sex dysphoria, those were things
uh,
like I dislike the fact that I had facial hair. I disliked how my body hair was, thicker and it formed in this male pattern. I disliked that I didn't have breasts. I disliked that, my body was shaped in a male fat pattern. I disliked how my sweat smelled male. These are all things of sex dysphoria. Meanwhile, gender
is that a
dysphoria. What?
no, go ahead.
Meanwhile,
I was
gender
just commenting on the
dysphoria
man.
was things like. Oh wait, do you want to comment about the male sweat?
No, I just thought that was I never really I yeah, I just think that's funny. I
It's very
just now.
funny. By the way, if you're
Yeah.
like a trans female who's been on HRT long enough, your dick smells like pussy. It's wild. It's so crazy.
That's trippy.
It's very trippy.
That's
So like part of the difference in like the way in which sweat smells between like males and females is due to gene expression and hormones. And if you change your hormones, like your sweat will smell different. And that's why girl dick smells like pussy. But then I was talking
that's interesting.
so yeah,
I'm gonna-
sex dysphoria was like I'm discomfortable with my biology and I want to change that along the lines of my biological sex. Meanwhile, gender dysphoria
Mm,
is I'm uncomfortable with how people perceive me. I'm uncomfortable with how people treat me. I'm uncomfortable with the expectations or roles which people assign to me based on how they perceive me. So that's where I distinguish
yeah,
sex dysphoria versus gender dysphoria. And so if I'm changing my presentation so that people are going to perceive me a certain way, that's me doing something to alleviate gender dysphoria, not sex dysphoria. And if I'm trying to alleviate sex dysphoria, that would be me doing things like taking hormones.
I don't think that majority of people are able to make that distinction with their feelings. So if you're being perceived as a gender, right? If I'm perceiving you right now as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, typically, the underlying prescription is that you're a female.
Mm, I think it's a good thing to decouple
As
those.
gender exists.
Although I guess like
Yes,
it kind of depends
but
on like what
people
you mean by like by like or like what exactly you mean by female and like what exactly assumptions you're making. I think that a
okay.
lot of those
Right
assumptions
now,
are I don't know. I
right now,
don't whenever I'm like perceiving someone as like a man or a woman, I'm not really thinking about like their biology all that much. I'm not really like being like, oh, that must mean that they can get pregnant, or that they have these like chromosomes, or that they have these like hormones or whatever. I'm much more so seeing them as like a social category. I don't know, maybe
Okay,
that's just
okay.
me, but like
Yeah, I
when I
think
perceive
you're
someone's gender, I don't immediately think they've got a dick between their legs or something.
yes, yeah. I think you're exceptional in that sense. I want you to view me for a moment as like a blue collar working conservative, okay? That
Mm-hmm.
is lens that I'm looking at gender through right now, like the status quo lens of gender. Okay? Like
Well, are we trying to have
how
a descriptive conversation, or are we trying to have a prescriptive conversation? Like, are we more so worried about how gender currently works, or are we trying to talk about how gender ought to work?
both. I
Okay.
think the way it works right now is stifling how it should work eventually. But
Yeah, I agree
okay,
with
so
that.
yeah, so I want you to hear what I'm saying as if I'm just a normal cis white American citizen engaging with gender.
Okay.
Okay. I see you. I see that you look like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
My underlying assumption there then is that you are a female, that you have a vagina and the corresponding chromosomes.
Yeah, I think that people do often make that assumption, although only if they're kind of like thinking about it from a biological standpoint. I'm not sure how
I,
often their brains actually go there. Although
I don't,
there are lots of cases where those assumptions are wrong on like certain extents.
yes,
But
yeah,
yeah, those
but I don't
assumptions
think,
are typically made. I would agree with that.
yeah, okay, yeah. The average person is not making a distinction in the way we are between sex and gender. They're very correlated. If you look like a woman, people will see you, assume that you're biologically aligned.
Yeah, I think that people do often make that assumption. I guess like what's your broader point?
Yes. My broader point is when you are that sex dysphoria and gender dysphoria are is not something that someone is internally able to distinguish between. When you have a dysphoria about your biological sex, you will present, like if you're a man who is a woman, you will present in the gender role of woman so that people will see you and think, oh, okay, their sex is female.
I think you'd only do that if you do have like a gender dysphoria though. If you're somebody who has a sex dysphoria but not a gender dysphoria, then you would do things like medically transition but not alter your presentation.
Uh, uh does does that so there's people who will have a sex dysphoria
Mhm.
who are male. They're biologically male, but they're a woman, and they will transition but not change their appearance, but not
Uh,
change their like outward social
yeah,
presentation.
something like an HRT femboy, somebody who like goes on HRT, but they're like like say like they become transsexual female by going on HRT, but they're like
Mhm.
I'm still a man, I'm still a boy or whatever. Like that exists.
Yeah, but it's still okay. Sorry, this is getting convoluted for me. So
Totally, totally.
a there's somebody who has sex dysphoria,
Hmm.
and they will change their sex without changing how they present socially.
Yeah, there are people like that exist. It's pretty rare, but it does happen.
Okay, well, that throws me off a little bit. Um,
Um, like for
uh,
example, a like somebody who, or like for example, imagine somebody who like they present themselves very femininely, But then they
Mhm.
like start taking testosterone because they want to do so, because of like a sex
Yeah,
dysphoria. Yeah,
and they,
Polyglot's boyfriend is on HRT, but he still uses he him.
how do people view them?
It depends. So the way in which we gender people is often based off of a combination of social presentation and certain biological characteristics. So sometimes it
Yes.
can end up changing how people perceive you. Other times you might be perceived more androgynously or more in one way or the other.
Yeah.
It kind of depends.
So when somebody when the average person will look at somebody and their brain starts gendering them,
Hmm.
biology is a big factor in that.
So they might make
So if
assumptions about their biology, but like
yes, yes,
sex dysphoria isn't about how others uh, perceive your biology. Sex dysphoria is about how you perceive your, or is about your feelings about your own biology.
so okay, so sex dysphoria is completely independent of external stimuli. It's just its own thing. It's entirely internal.
Yeah, I would say that sex dysphoria is a discomfort with one's own biological sex characteristics and a desire to change those.
Okay, then gender. Dude, I forgot where we're going with this now.
And then gender dysphoria is the discomfort with the way in which society perceives and treats you along the lines of gender. Yeah, I don't know where we were
Yes.
going with this, but that's how I would distinguish gender dysphoria from sex dysphoria.
I asked you to restate something. Do you remember what it was?
Not at all. You were talking about the distinction between gender dysphoria and sex dysphoria, and
Mm-hmm.
then yeah, that's how we got into this tangent.
It was before that. Right before that.
Hmm, I'm not sure.
Um, people.
We could always
Okay,
watch
yeah.
Ben Shapiro react to femboys at any time. We can also always do that.
If that's what you'd like to do, you can definitely go ahead
I
and
mean,
do.
if you had any other points or things you wanted to bring up, we can totally do that. I think we're kind of getting to a point where we're starting to circle, and where I think that we agree on our broad prescriptions, um, and
Oh yeah, yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, the
yeah,
broad. Yeah, we're on the broad prescriptions. We don't agree on how we're handling it right now to get there. I think there. Okay, I remember now. I think there's an issue when you have um, people with gender dysphoria who try to alleviate that dysphoria by conforming to a binary.
hmm. If they're conforming to something simply to seek external validation, um, yeah, I think that is definitely seeking validation externally rather than internally, which is not the most healthy thing to do. Although I can certainly see situations where somebody might be motivated to do so out of like safety concerns. But if
Yes.
we as a society can broadly push towards a society where we are more accepting of people, regardless of what sex characters they have, regardless of how they present themselves, then I think that would make us more amicable towards people presenting themselves authentically as they wish to be, in spite of societal roles or expectations. And so, just being chill about trans people with respect to how they want to identify, whatever pronouns they want to go to, absolutely brings us closer to that society.
I don't think so because it's still you're
Wait,
still
if you say
like
I'm going to accept you as a trans person in spite of how you present yourself, in spite of what your biology is, then that helps them to not feel like they have to conform, right?
yes, yes.
Then we agree.
Then yeah, but trans people are still it's still they're still doing it. It's still happening.
Okay, and so are cis people, and we both agree that we want that to not be a thing. So us being more accepting in general is going to help us get closer to that society.
Not if we're accepting in the sense not if we're accepting people continuing to prop up gender norms.
But isn't the better thing to do to be like, I will still see you as a woman and treat you as a woman regardless of if you wear a dress or wear your hair long? Like, isn't that the messaging you want to be putting forward?
I don't know.
Because if that's
That's
not the
what.
messaging, then you would be reinforcing social systems which encourage people to conform in spite of authentic presentation.
No, I think there's an alternative there. I think that we can accept people as people
Hmm.
rather than seeing them as whatever gender identity they want to um, be a part of. I think it's an issue that people are identifying with gender to begin with.
Are are you non-binary and just projecting your feelings onto everyone? Is that what this is?
Quite possibly. That's quite possibly.
I think that's what's happening.
No, I
I
I
I
think
think there's a good chance you're non-binary and that you are projecting
I
these
have
feelings onto everyone.
okay. I'm not non-binary, unfortunately. I have too much toxic masculinity built up over the years that I just have to identify as a man. There's no use in trying to fucking run from it at this point. Okay, I just have to accept it. But
Wait, why
I
are you a
think
man?
because doing presenting otherwise will hurt my little toxic masculine goblin, and he'll start throwing stuff.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I have been raised and conditioned as a man, so I have a lot of man baggage,
Uh-huh.
and yeah,
Yeah, like
it's
I used
not
to have a
as
lot of man baggage too. I think that dropping the man baggage to be your authentic self is a good thing, right?
yeah, I do that. I try to do that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's not as easy to just
So like, I mean, like, do
drop.
you want to be a man?
No, I want to be a person,
Oh my gosh, you're literally
right?
non-binary. You are.
No, I know. No, I'm not. I'm not. I think
I'm gonna
everybody.
let you in on I'm gonna let you in on a secret right now. Cis men want to be men. They don't want to just be a non-binary person.
I think everybody should be a non-binary person. I think binaries existing, I think gender categories existing is inherently harmful and destroys individuality.
My dude, I think that you will do yourself wonders to read more about the non-binary experience and non-binary identity
No,
because that
listen,
is
listen.
such a non-binary take. You are
Yes,
yes,
yes.
I think you're
I
just
want.
non-binary.
Yeah, I strive to be non-binary. Okay, but listen, I still can't escape that
If you want to
masculine.
be non-binary, you can just be non-binary.
I don't feel non-binary.
Okay, I think that a lot of people don't really like feel like a strong sense of like there
I
are
want
definitely
to be
lots of
non.
people who don't have this like strong feeling, but it seems you want to be non-binary. So why not just be non-binary?
I, I mean, I feel like I am like I am non-binary, but there's no. I don't get any internal validation from people viewing me as non-binary. I only get that validation. I only get validation by people viewing me as men and viewing me as typically typically the validation that I get is when people see the toxic masculine sides of me,
How is that
which sucks.
validating?
It feels good.
It feels good to be seen as a toxic masculine person?
Yep.
How so?
I wish it. I don't know. I'm not in control of my feelings. They just happen. I watch it happen. I recognize that it's bad. I see myself as a victim of this, of the way I was raised, right?
Hmm.
But when people, my experience with gender is people, I want people to view me as a man.
Hmm. Why?
Now, separating,
because it feels good. Okay?
Okay.
Separating my thoughts from my feelings. My thoughts are I want to be non-binary. My feelings are that people need to see me as a big, tough lumberjack man.
And how would it be? How would it feel to be viewed as non-binary?
That doesn't feel like much. I don't have a internal response to it.
Hmm. Do you prefer that lack of an internal response?
The lack of internal response also is accompanied by the um, lack of man validation that I get.
Mm-hmm. How would it feel to be viewed as like a big tough man versus like a big tough non-binary person?
I don't think that that's possible
How so?
because people have preconceived notions about people who are non-binary, and non-binary characteristics are not typically big, tough, and strong.
I don't think there's any one way to look non-binary. I think that non-binary people
So
can be the
either.
most feminine person you have ever seen. I think that non-binary can be the most masculine person you have ever seen. I think that non-binary can be androgynous. Non-binary can be non-binary is absolutely an umbrella term that accounts
Yes.
for a wide range of identity, presentation,
Yes.
biology, all this stuff. And you can
Yeah.
absolutely be the big tough non-binary person if that's who you want to be.
No, I agree with your broad point, but when you put, but you're talking about being non-binary in a vacuum. We're not in a vacuum. We're in this convoluted social structure that prevents certain perceptions from reaching me if I identify a certain way.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that for lots of non-binary people, it can be something where they view themselves differently than how society typically views themselves. Like for
I
example,
do that.
I'm non-binary. Society views me as a woman. I can reconcile
Yep.
both of these facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess I'm non-binary and want to be perceived as a man.
Sick. Non-binary
Yeah.
identity is pretty cool.
Yeah.
We're 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 making omelets on stream, folks.
You just reverse conversion therapied me.
I think that this non-binary identity was much more so intrinsic to you, but you lacked the understanding to
Yes.
vocalize it.
No. I knew I've experimented with it before. I've thought about it. I know this part of me. I've met it before. When I think of myself, I think of myself as somebody who exists independent of social structures. But
Dude,
I
you're
still
so
have the
non-binary.
yes, I know. I'm not disputing that. I know that, okay? But the but there's still like social baggage that's like been systemically beaten into me that I just have to walk around with.
Yeah,
That's the issue right now.
that's something
Yeah.
that's very much common with non-binary experience.
Yeah, it sucks ass.
Ah, all right, this conversation was
But
wild.
yeah, no, this was worth it. But
I
I
like how we
also
went from discussing the merits of transgenderism into gender therapy live
yeah.
on stream.
I also might be bi-curious. You want to walk me through that?
What do you mean?
I want the idea of sucking dick is attractive to me, okay? But I don't
Would you
want
suck a
to
girl's dick or a guy's dick?
either or. I don't care.
That's valid, yeah.
Preferably a girl's dick.
I'm with you there,
Actually,
yeah.
yeah. But I don't want to have penetrative sex with a man.
Also valid.
Yeah, yeah,
Would you fuck a trans girl?
yes.
Sick.
A trans girl is a biological male who present if they're feminine enough, if they're feminine presenting enough, yes.
Like a transsexual, like yeah, obviously someone you find attractive.
Yeah, I'm attracted to femininity. So if you're a biological male who's very feminine, that's
So
wait.
you'd also go for like a femboy.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of people, kind of their attraction is much more so along the lines of gender than like sexuality. I think there's lots of guys out there that identify as straight that would totally fuck a femboy.
Absolutely. It happens all the time. Or people who are like cis straight Andrew Tate watchers who are having secret hotel sex with trans women. It happens all the time.
hmm Nice. Also,
Uh,
just like a bit of terminology that I think is very useful to use. If you're talking about someone who's like medically transitioned, I am all for using the term transsexual because if you say like a transsexual female like myself is like a biological male, you are absolutely misrepresenting much of my biology. Because we acknowledge that sex exists along a spectrum. Somebody who medically transitions does move over on that spectrum in many sex categories, and that's where the utility of the term transsexual female or transsexual male to refer to someone who medically transitions their biological sex. So I would say like yeah we can talk about attraction to like a transsexual female who's a trans woman or like a femboy who is just a cissexual male. I think there's absolutely a utility in using the term transsexual for that.
wait. I did not have a pen and paper ready for that. I need you to a little slower with that one. When do I use transsexual?
I would say that transsexual is specifically referring to the biological sex of somebody who medically transitions. So my biological sex is
Okay.
that of a transsexual female.
Yes, that makes a lot. Okay, yeah. No, I
Yeah,
get that.
because like if you were to say that like a trans woman who's medically transitioned is like a biological male, you're definitely misrepresenting a lot of her biology.
Yeah,
But
that's like
transsexual female would be objective in referring to her biology.
it'd be untrue to refer to them as biological
Yeah,
male.
I agree. Sick.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
conversation was wild.
Yeah, it was. Um, I think what I'm trying to say, my broader point is that people, the way that we go about transitioning from having a gender structure to not having a gender structure is by kind of,
Everybody identifying as non-binary.
yeah, basically just kind of carrying the weight of your. There's like no good way to go about this, but it seems like the quickest, fastest path is for everybody to just like internalize their shit and deal with it until we can get this gender thing figured out rather than presenting as gender binaries. I think that just slows it down.
Um, yeah, I think there's definitely an interesting conversation to be had about the best route as for achieving gender abolition. I think that everybody identifying as non-binary is certainly one route that would be rather effective.
Yes. Yeah. Would you agree then that it's that people how do I say this? People ought not to care about or people can't have internal identities based around other people's perceptions of those identities. Because if I'm a gamer
hmm
and somebody doesn't think I'm a gamer, I'm still a gamer.
I agree with that. Yeah, yeah, and
I'm a
I would
fucking
say that
gamer.
a trans woman is still valid even if a transphobe says something transphobic about her. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yes. So if we can just roll with that while we deconstruct the other gender bullshit instead of having people present in binaries to soothe their own gender dysphoria. I think that's better.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that if we could live in a society where
We
we're
have to
much more so chill about these things, such that there's not a pressure to conform to gender, then that
I'm
makes it
saying you have
easier to break it down.
I'm saying you have to not conform through the pressure.
Hmm. Yeah, we can
That should be the
also
duty
we
of a
can
trans
encourage
person.
people to be themselves in spite of the pressure, while also breaking down the pressure. I think that both of those help us achieve that goal.
Yeah, but in order to break down that, it's completely antithetical to try to break down that pressure while having people relieve the pressure by taking part in the pressure.
What do you mean? What do you mean by taking part in the pressure?
By conforming to a bind. Somebody who self-identifies as a woman, they want to be perceived as a woman, so they present as a woman.
So I would agree that like conformity for the sake of conformity is not a good thing.
I conformity for the sake of
Validation.
relief gender dysphoria. Conforming for the sake of anything.
I don't know if I'm willing to draw such a hard line there because there are some instances where conforming can be required out of safety, but yeah,
Yeah,
in
yeah. Well,
general,
that's different though.
okay, yeah,
Like when there's
yeah.
niche
As
circumstances
long as
where
we
you're
recognize it
at.
as much more so like a soft line and one that we want to more so like broadly work towards a social change where people are encouraged to be authentic in spite of societal expectations, and where we try to loosen those societal expectations, then yes, that achieves our goal.
Yes. So
Yes.
if you identify as a woman, if you're a woman, you shouldn't. Do I want to say that? Hold on. I'm gonna say this, but I'm allowed to take it back, and everyone's has to forget that I said
You're
it.
always allowed to change your mind. Go for it.
Okay. If you are if you identify as a woman and you're a biological man, no, male, yeah, you should not uh, wear a dress around in public.
Why not? What if you want to wear a dress? Like what if you personally believe that dresses are more comfortable, or that that's how you like to express yourself because that's just how you like to exist?
Then you can do that, but you can't um, outwardly ask for the perception of a woman.
Because you're wearing the dress, or just you can't say
Yeah,
that
you
you
can't do
identify as a
both.
woman.
No, you can say that you identify as a woman, but if you do, you shouldn't wear a dress. And if you want to wear a dress, then you
Wait,
shouldn't.
wait. If we take this argument to its logical conclusion, don't we just reinvent gender but in the opposite way? Like if we say if you identify as a woman, you can't wear a dress, you have to wear like men's clothing or whatever, then we just reinvented gender, but you now have to do the opposite gender roles.
No. If you no,
And if you
if
say women
you
can't wear dresses, you're just reinventing gender at that point.
no no no. women can women can wear dresses. Okay, if you identify. Wait, no, fuck, you're right. Hold on.
Yeah, it does just reinvent gender. I think the correct prescription to have here is people should express themselves in the ways in which they are most authentic and comfortable, and we should do everything we can
Yes.
to eliminate societal expectations of certain forms of presentation based off of certain forms of
Yeah.
identity or whatever your biology is.
Okay, maybe you shouldn't identify as a woman. Maybe that's what it is.
What's wrong with
I
identifying as a woman?
it's um unsustainable and inauthentic.
I don't think it's inauthentic. If your
I
prescription
think
is
it
that we should all identify as non-binary,
yes.
I think that is I guess okay. This is an interesting one because like I broadly agree that if we all identify as non-binary and we abolish gender that way, that things would be better. Um, but I just don't think that that's very actionable. Because I
It's
feel like people are just
actionable.
gonna say that and be like, "Okay, weirdo."
Yeah, they probably will for a little bit until
But I
their
feel like
sons.
something like, just be like chill with respect to people's gender identity, with respect to people's gender presentation. It's weird to tell someone they have to be this or that because they present themselves a certain way. I think that is a lot more
I,
actionable, and I think that also
I,
does better at eliminating pressure to conform, which seems to be what
I
your
don't
big issue is.
I don't want to be chill about it. I don't want people. I think the only reason people identify as a woman is because they're conditioned to. How else do you arrive at that conclusion? A
So
woman is a con.
So
You're not
you
born.
you yourself am having a hard time seeing why people can have a gender identity that is not binary, or that is
I
not
see that.
non-binary, because you are
No.
non-binary. You are
No. Wait,
projecting
wait, wait, wait.
you are projecting your
Wait, hold on.
non-binary feelings onto people that have
No,
binary gender
no,
identities.
no. I'm
I'm
not.
telling you, you
Okay.
are.
No, I know. I know what you're telling me. Listen, okay. People, I know why and how that happens. I'm saying that it shouldn't happen. I don't see any world where people should identify for their like core identity to be that of a woman.
What do you mean by core?
Are people's? I think people
Are you
have
saying you can be a woman,
people.
just don't make it your whole personality?
No, that's cringe. I can't. That's not what I'm saying. Well, no, I'm saying you can't be a woman, and also, yeah, don't make it your personality. But don't not make it your personality.
You're just non-binary and
People,
you're projecting those feelings onto others. There are definitely people that have a very
yeah,
strong sense of a gender
yes.
identity, that they belong to
Wait, hold on.
this certain gendered group, and I think that that's okay. And
No.
it's okay for them to have that
The gender
identity,
group,
so long as we're working to
the gender,
eliminate like the expectation of conformity.
the gendered group doesn't exist outside of our societal constructions. If we get rid of it and put
Hmm.
that same person who is a woman in a world in a society where gender doesn't exist as we have it now, they're not gonna grow up and identify as a woman.
Correct.
Yes, identifying the fact that people identify as women, that that is a core staple of people's identity, is bad. Not because they're bad, but because they're in a
Hmm.
system that facilitates that kind of thing.
Um.
There's
I
no,
I guess like
we've already,
I think that I don't know. I feel like this critique, as long as you're levying this critique against the system of gender, that's okay.
yes.
But if you're levying it against like individuals, I think that it doesn't really encapsulate how much individuals are products of their condition.
I think that individuals who are products of their conditions should not um, conform to gender binaries, even if it's a
Yeah,
means of
I think
absolving.
that pushing against conformity for the sake of conformity is a good thing. I just don't think it's very actionable to tell people, you're wrong for identifying as a woman. Start identifying as non-binary. You know, like, unless people have the exact same ideological prescriptions about gender that you do, it's just not a convincing argument.
Should they should?
Well, I know you should, but we have to convince people to get there. And I think that
Yeah,
in the process
yeah,
of
but
convincing
yes,
people, being chill
and no,
is the easiest prescription, is
no,
the best prescription that gets us closer to that.
because if we're in the process of convincing people and people are looking around, we can't be in the process of convincing people while encouraging gender conformity.
I don't think I've ever said that that we ought to encourage gender conformity.
To say that it's okay for trans people to alleviate their dysphoria by conforming to gender is encouraging it.
So my prescription is that the best thing we can do is just chill out about people in order to alleviate gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a product of society, and so if we as a society are just like, okay, cool, I'll call you by the pronouns you want, I'm going to like treat you as the gender you want, like that is what helps to alleviate conformity for the sake of conformity.
It reinforces gender norms.
By saying you can be whatever gender you want in spite of how you present yourself, that enforces gender norms.
Say that again?
So I'm saying if we move towards a society where we're like, you can be whatever gender you wish to be in spite of how you present yourself, in spite of your biology, that is going to eliminate conformity for the sake of conformity, because now there's no reason why you would want to conform, because people are going to affirm your gender identity regardless of your gender presentation. So if we chill out about gender, then there's no motivation to conform to alleviate gender dysphoria, because alleviating gender dysphoria by being affirmed will just be granted at default if that's the direction we move towards.
Yeah. But people aren't doing that. People
I'm saying we should do that. That's the direction we should move towards, because that's more actionable than telling everybody I just identify as non-binary because of my ideological prescriptions.
Which are true, but yes.
I agree with your I agree with your ideological prescriptions, but I just don't think it's actionable.
I'm not telling people to identify as non-binary. I'm telling people to stop seeking external validation for their internal identity.
Okay. I agree with that. The question is, how do we go about doing that? And I presented a solution that can bring us closer to that.
Act chill.
Just respect people's gender identity, regardless of their presentation and their biology. That brings us closer to that.
No, but it still does the thing where it's still having a gender identity shouldn't be a thing.
Okay. So if we move towards a society where gender identity is respected regardless of gender, eventually eventually it becomes so amalgamous and nothing that it's a lot easier to eliminate.
Yes, except during that process, people are presenting themselves as gender binaries.
I mean, I think that so long as it's part of the process of abolishing gender, then we're moving towards a better direction. Like, I think you just want to. I think you just want us to abolish gender overnight. And sure, I'd love that, but we're just not gonna do that. We're not just gonna abolish gender overnight.
No. I'm saying when we just when someone is alleviating their gender dysphoria by conforming to gender binaries, they are prolonging the process.
I'm not advocating for people conforming for the sake of alleviating gender dysphoria. I'm saying that my prescription for alleviating gender dysphoria is people should just grant people their gender identity. That's the better way to alleviate gender dysphoria and to eliminate pressure to conform.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
Oh my gosh. We're doing we're doing the is ought gap.
Doable.
So I'm saying we ought to do that, and let's work towards just respecting people's gender identity so that we can achieve that.
I'm saying we are doing that, and it's not going super well.
Well, there's a push for that, and I think that we can continue to push for that. Obviously, there are still transphobic people in the world, and I think that addressing transphobes and like teaching people, hey, it's a good thing to be respectful, is going to bring us closer to the world where we can
Yes.
just all
Okay,
identify as
yes.
non-binary.
Now we take everybody be chill, and we combine it with stop alleviating your gender dysphoria by conforming to a binary.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Double wrong. So trans people ought not to alleviate their gender dysphoria by conforming to a binary.
Correct.
Okay, perfect.
Oh my goodness.
All right. That took me a long time to say.
That's okay. That's okay. All right, we did it. We got there. Everybody just identify as non-binary, and we can solve everything.
Yes.
There we go.
And
You are so
also,
non-binary, my dude.
yes, we know. I know, okay? Trans people don't exist. I think they're saying, I'm reading a comment. I think they're saying trans people don't exist. Just be non-binary. No. I'm saying trans people do exist because of the systems that they're raised in, and they should not conform to the system so we can get rid of it. Because by they're alleviating the dysphoria by conforming to those systems. They exist, but they shouldn't exist, which sounds bad, but please,
I think
that's not.
so. I think the best way to like phrase this is that there certainly exists a pressure for trans people as well as cis people, more so cis people even, to conform to gendered roles and expectations, even if it is inauthentic to who they wish to be, simply for the sake of societal acceptance and to be seen and perceived in a gender role which is consistent with their identity. And so if we were to move to society where we alleviate that pressure to conform, and where so people don't conform for the sake of conformity but rather present themselves authentically, that is the better thing to do. So alleviating pressure to conform is a good thing, and being authentic in spite of pressure to conform is a good thing. I think that that's the better way to word those prescriptions.
Yeah, it's a necessary thing, I think.
All right, well, we got there. Thank you for coming on the stream. We after 2 hours or so
That was 2 hours.
in the
Holy-
trenches and
Can't
in
even
gender
hear a
therapy,
man
we have
and
got
left a
there.
non-binary femboy.
What?
I came in here a man and left a non-binary femboy.
Proud of you. That is so powerful. Very proud of
Really.
you. Oh my goodness. Thank you, thank you. I hope you have a lovely night.